So we're interested in this drug called Bydureon, which other name is exenatide, which is a licensed drug for the treatment of type 2 diabetes. There are between 6 and 10 million people around the world using it for their diabetes. The good thing about it helps diabetes by making high blood sugar normal, but it doesn't make normal blood sugar low. It's an injection that people can self-administer once a week, or they can ask their carer to inject them under the skin. And that's done by pinching a roll of skin, injecting either in the stomach, or it could be in the thigh, could be in the arm. And it's generally very well tolerated. It has minor side effects causing a little bit of nausea, but it can also cause weight loss. And this is important if we're thinking about using it in people that might be underweight. We know from laboratory data that as well as having an effect on blood sugar, it seems to have an effect on nerve cells, and it can help them survive in the context of toxins or unfavourable environments that may be relevant to Parkinson's disease. So we've gone on and already completed 2 clinical trials of using this drug in patients with Parkinson's disease, and in both of those small trials so far we've shown that there have been positive effects in patients with Parkinson's disease. So we now want to move on to a formal phase 3 efficacy trial to prove whether this drug is or is not a useful treatment to slow down disease progression in Parkinson's patients. Bydureon was discussed at a meeting called the Linked Clinical Trials meeting, and out of a whole range of compounds that were thought to be potentially interested for Parkinson's disease, it was selected as the #1 most exciting and encouraging compound to be tested in Parkinson's patients. The reason for this is that it appears to act on insulin signalling in nerve cells, and by so doing acts on a range of processes all relevant for cell survival. So from this Linked Clinical Trials meeting, supported by the Cure Parkinson's Trust, we did the very first trial of exenatide in patients with Parkinson's disease back in 2010. This was an open label trial because at that point we didn't even have access to the placebo version of exenatide. And we compared patients over the course of 1 year to see if they would be better off using exenatide compared to their regular Parkinson's treatments. So this was encouraging, that we found that there was an advantage not only in the movement aspects of Parkinson's disease, but also in the non-movement, the memory and thinking aspects of Parkinson's disease. With this data, we then were successful to get access to a placebo version of exenatide, and we moved on to do a slightly larger double-blind placebo-controlled trial, which essentially replicated the results from the first trial. We now have funding to do a larger phase 3 efficacy trial to confirm whether the results we found in the last trial of Bydureon can be replicated in a multi-centre design and be confident that exenatide does have effects on the severity of symptoms in Parkinson's disease. We want to also build on this and find out that the small advantage that we believe is there at 1 year is not just the only advantage of exenatide, but this is the effect that is seen every year, such that the difference between patients on exenatide and placebo is double that at 2 years compared to that seen at 1 year. And that will be demonstrating that there's a cumulative advantage, and it's not just a small symptomatic effect of exenatide. We thought long and hard about the design of the trial, and obviously the longer people are involved, the more evidence we can get whether exenatide does have this cumulative effect year on year. We talked to patients about the acceptability of this, and we compromised on a total length of the trial of 2 years. We think longer than 2 years might be unacceptable to patients who might be allocated to be on placebo exenatide to be the comparison group, whereas we want to have as long a period of time as possible. We think this is the best compromise to get the best data so we can learn about the usefulness of exenatide in the longer term. The primary outcome for this trial will be the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale, in which we measure the severity of the motor problems of Parkinson's, the slowness, stiffness, tremor, walking problems, balance problems, and we'll measure that at the start of the trial, or we'll measure it every 6 months for the whole 2-year period. We'll decide if exenatide is useful based on whether there's a difference between patients who have been on exenatide for 2 years compared to people who have been on the placebo for 2 years. But then we'll also look to see if there's an increased advantage at 2 years compared to any difference that we might see at 1 year. And that should distinguish whether the effects of exenatide are purely on hiding the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, or if there's a cumulative advantage in terms of slowing down the rate of progression of Parkinson's disease. Of course, we'll also look at the non-movement aspects of Parkinson's, measuring people's memory and thinking problems, measuring their mood problems, and the host of other non-motor symptoms that can be troublesome in Parkinson's disease. We'll take blood samples, and in a small population that will be invited to have a lumbar puncture, so we can look at the spinal fluid as well, but that's an optional part of the trial. We want the criteria for inclusion to be as broad as possible, such that the results are relevant to the majority of people with Parkinson's, not just a small subgroup. However, we're slightly constrained by the practical aspects of a trial. Patients have got to be able to get to a trial centre when they haven't taken their regular Parkinson's pills. So they may be more shaky, or they may be more unsteady on their feet than they are when they're at their best. So if people are unable to come to the centre to have their Parkinson's measured first thing in the morning without taking their regular pills, then they shouldn't participate in the trial. So we've written down formal criteria that we hope will mean that all the people included are representative of the population of patients with Parkinson's disease, but don't run into trouble by participating. Patients in the UK, we're going to open sites here at UCL, but also at King's College in London, in Plymouth, in Oxford, and in Manchester. We'll also open a site in Edinburgh. And the reason we're restricting the sites to quite a small number is to minimise the inter-rater variability. Because when we use the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale, each rater may be slightly different in their rating, and we want to make sure that we get as clean a signal as possible so we don't miss important effects just by chance alone. The other reason why we're only opening a few sites across the country is that we have a finite supply of drug, and we have to make sure we successfully deliver the trial without running out of our drug supplies. And the more sites we open, the more likelihood there might be some wastage because of fridges breaking down, or transport difficulties, or just wastage because there is insufficient numbers of patients recruited at a site. So we're going to restrict the number of sites where we recruit to make sure we deliver the trial successfully. The Cure Parkinson's Trust will be funding a sub-study in which we'll be using sensors to see if we can better measure the severity of patients with Parkinson's disease. This will be led by the team in Oxford, who are going to use a smartphone to see if the smartphone can measure tremor when the phone is held at rest, or if it's held at arm's length, to see how severe the tremor may be during the course of the trial. The smartphone will also be used to measure the speed of movement by tapping on the surface of the phone and measuring whether speed is affected during the course of the trial. There'll be a second sensor that can be attached to the skin over the lower back that can measure the number of steps and the speed of walking at baseline and during the follow-up period of 2 years. We're also going to be collecting blood samples periodically through the course of the trial, and that will give us the ability to look at the genes that cause Parkinson's disease and whether people respond to exenatide differently according to any genes that they may carry. We'll also be looking at the serum samples to see if there are any changes that occur during the course of the trial which may be relevant to the mechanism of action of exenatide on insulin signaling or some of the survival proteins. We'll decide the details of those analyses according to the latest science when we've collected all the samples at the end of the trial. We're in the process at the moment of getting all the permissions we need in order to start the trial and make sure it's conducted to the highest possible standards. We're hoping to have everything in place by October 2019, and then we'll spend 18 months recruiting our 200 patients across our different sites. We're hoping that by recruiting 1 or 2 people at each site per week, that we'll have enough resources at each site to make sure people are looked after well and all their needs are met. We'll be following the 200th person up for a further 2 years, and then we'll have all the data we need to be able to decide whether this is a useful treatment or not. It'll take a few months to do the analysis and to prepare all the data for publication, and then we'll have an answer about whether this is a useful drug in the treatment of patients with Parkinson's disease.